The Viet Cong put a price on their heads. Enemy fighters who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing into a landscape they knew by memory, who had turned invisibility into their most lethal tactical weapon, formally decided that 11 black Labrador retrievers purchased from a Sydney dog pound were dangerous enough to be worth money to kill. The Australian Army agreed with the Viet Cong's assessment entirely. It sent those dogs into one of the most unforgiving counterinsurgency campaigns of the 20th century, kept them in the field for up to 5 years while their handlers rotated home every 12 months. And when the war was over, informed the men who had served with them that the dogs could not return to Australia. No repatriation, no exceptions, no explanation that the men who applied and appealed and begged were ever given. The enemy had formally acknowledged what these animals were worth. The government that deployed them took 50 years to say the same. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard the names Caesar, Marcus, Tiber, or any of the 11 before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question what a country owes the animals it sends to war. Now let's go. To understand why 11 dogs from a municipal pound became targets worth killing in the jungles of South Vietnam, you must first understand what Phuoc Tuy Province actually was, and what the Viet Cong could do there that no conventional military force had yet found a reliable answer to. The first Australian task force arrived in Phuoc Tuy Province in April and May of 1966 and established its main operating base at Nui Dat, 8 kilometers north of Ba Ria in the province's interior. They constructed a 12-kilometer perimeter of barbed wire, cleared a 500-meter killing zone around its entire circumference, and ringed it with claymore mines and anti-personnel mine belts. The occupation of the site required the resettlement of approximately 4,000 people from the villages of Long Phuoc and Long Hai, whose presence within a 4,000-meter radius was considered incompatible with the base's security. The Australians arrived, in other words, by removing the community they had come to protect from the immediate vicinity of the place they intended to protect it from. Phuoc Tuy was the southernmost province of Third Corps, roughly 70 kilometers southeast of Saigon, accessible by sea through the port at Vung Tau. The Australians had chosen it deliberately. It was an area of significant Viet Cong activity, which gave them something to fight. It was bounded by coast on one side, which gave them a resupply route not dependent on road access through hostile territory. And it was compact enough that a single task force, properly employed, might actually dominate it rather than being absorbed into the general enormity of the American effort further north. The Australians came to Phuoc Tuy with an institutional memory that most other Allied forces did not share. Their senior officers had served in the Malayan Emergency and the Indonesian confrontation. They had experience fighting an insurgency embedded in a civilian population in dense terrain against an enemy who refused to mass his forces and accept the kind of battle that superior firepower could win decisively. Patient, precise, intelligence-driven pressure was the doctrine. Smaller patrols, longer ambushes, and the slow, methodical work of finding out exactly where the enemy was before attempting to destroy him. The problem was the Viet Cong's most important capability, the D-445. Provincial Battalion and the 275th Regiment of the 5th Viet Cong Division had been operating in Phuoc Tuy for years before the Australians arrived. They knew the province's terrain with the intimacy of people who had grown up in it, fought in it, and built their entire military doctrine around its specific qualities. The rubber plantations with their ordered rows of trees, the dense scrub of the long high hills running along the coast, the network of jungle tracks, creek lines, and paddy field margins that could move a man silently across the province in darkness without appearing on a road or in a village. What the Viet Cong could do, that no army operating in Phuoc Tuy had found a systematic answer to, was disappear After any firefight, any ambush, any engagement at any scale, the enemy broke contact and dissolved back into the landscape. A patrol that had been exchanging fire with a Viet Cong unit 30 seconds ago would find, in the silence that followed the shooting, that there was nothing in front of them to pursue. The jungle had absorbed whoever they had been fighting. The trees were the same. The undergrowth was the same. The men who had just been there were gone. This was not a tactical inconvenience. It was a strategic system. An enemy who could always disengage, who could always refuse a decisive engagement on terms that favored the better armed opponent, could always survive to fight again. The Viet Cong understood this completely and had built their entire approach to Phuoc Tuy around it. They would hit the Australians when the odds favored them and vanish when they did not. They would wound the task force, exhaust it, absorb its casualties over time, and wait. Human trackers could read the signs the enemy left. But they moved slowly and required constant caution against the ambushes the Viet Cong frequently set on their own withdrawal routes. And they depended entirely on physical evidence that a disciplined enemy could reduce and disguise. The intelligence the task force needed was precisely the intelligence that the jungle refused to give up on its own terms. The case for a different kind of soldier had already been made. It had just not yet been answered. The answer had been working in another jungle entirely, for the better part of 2 decades. The British Army had been running tracker dog teams through the Malayan jungle since the late 1940s, through the 12 years of the Malayan emergency, and then through the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo in the early 1960s. Their experience had been accumulated against an enemy pursuing the same doctrine as the Viet Cong. A guerrilla force embedded in dense terrain, operating in small groups, capable of breaking contact and disappearing into vegetation that defeated conventional pursuit. What the British had found was that a trained dog, following a human scent through that vegetation, could do what no human tracker, no aerial reconnaissance, and no intelligence network could do with anything like the same speed or reliability. It could follow the enemy after he had gone. Australian and New Zealand Special Forces units had served alongside British formations in Malaya and Borneo. They had watched the tracker dog teams work with enough frequency to understand that what they were observing was not a novelty or a fortunate accident, but a genuine military capability with a consistent and reproducible record of effectiveness. When the decision was made to establish a similar program for the Australian task force deploying to Vietnam, the British Army's Royal Army Veterinary Corps and Special Air Service provided the initial expertise. The tracking wing was established as a subunit of the School of Infantry at Ingleburn in New South Wales. It was not a reinvention. It was an inheritance, taken directly from the people who had developed and tested it under comparable conditions. The choice of breed was deliberate and specific. Labradors were selected because they had a well-developed nose, a strong drive to work, and a temperament that could be stabilized under stress. A 1967 documentary on the training program noted one quality above all others. Labradors could be taught not to bark. And they won't. In a jungle where sound carried and silence was the difference between finding the enemy and walking into an ambush, a dog that would give no audible indication of its presence was not merely convenient. It was operationally essential. The Labrador's physical build confirmed the choice. Water-retrieving dogs in a landscape of monsoon rivers, paddy field drainage channels, and flash flood creek crossings could move through terrain that would stop other breeds entirely. A standard combat tracker team consisted of 2 dogs with their handlers, 2 visual trackers, and 2 covermen, 1 machine gunner and 1 signaler, totaling approximately 7 or 8 personnel. The visual trackers read the physical record, the broken vegetation, the displaced earth, the direction of movement, the number of individuals. The dog followed what the eye could not see, the scent trail that persisted through the jungle long after the physical signs had degraded or been deliberately obscured. Together, they could do what neither could manage separately, which was follow a specific human being through a specific piece of jungle at a speed and with a reliability that no other available method could match. They needed dogs, 11 of them. The army went looking, as armies with limited budgets often do, in the most economical place available. Caesar was a black Labrador Kelpie cross, purchased from a Sydney dog refuge in 1966 for approximately $2. Marcus was a black Labrador donated by Sir Roden Cutler, the Governor of New South Wales, and a Victoria Cross recipient from the Second World War. One of the more remarkable facts about the program's resourcing is that a dog contributed by the state's most distinguished living soldier would end up serving the entire duration of the Vietnam War, without ever being able to come home. The others, Tiber, Justin, Janus, Julian, Milo, Trajan, Juno, Cassius, and Marcion, arrived from whatever sources the army could find, some from pounds, some from private donations, none valued at anything that a Sydney restaurant would charge for a single meal. All 11 were given the names of people who had ruled empires. In the context of a war that was partly a debate about what imperial authority in Southeast Asia meant and whether it deserved to persist, the irony was presumably unintended. But the names would prove strangely apt. These animals would outlast the men deployed alongside them. They would serve continuously for years while their handlers rotated home and were replaced by strangers. They would carry the knowledge of a landscape through handler after handler, the way institutional knowledge is supposed to travel. Imperfectly, at cost, with significant losses along the way. The 10 months of training at Ingleburn began with the most fundamental requirement. The bond between handler and dog had to be built before anything else could be taught. Handlers were responsible for every aspect of the dog's daily existence: the morning run, the grooming, the obedience training, the kennel cleaning, the road walks that hardened the paws for the terrain ahead. They took the dogs to rifle ranges during live firing, progressively desensitizing the animals to the sounds and physical sensations that combat would produce, in quantities no training facility could fully replicate. Formal tracking began in the program's 5th month. The dogs were leashed in harnesses and sent through jungle terrain after South Vietnamese soldiers, whose diet and lifestyle produced a scent profile that differed from the Australians around them, approximating the difference the dogs would need to identify and follow in the field. Private Peter Heron was 18 years old when he began training with Caesar, 19 when they deployed together aboard a RAAF Hercules C-130 on the 7th of May, 1967. Private Dennis Ferguson, known universally as Fergie, trained Marcus through the same program and deployed with him within weeks. 2 dogs, 1 province, and an enemy that had not yet understood what was coming for them. On the 12th of May, 1967, 35 days after the first tracker dogs arrived in Vietnam, the Australian Army lost one. Cassius was one of the 2 original trial dogs, the program still in its proving phase when he died. He had not conducted a single combat tracking mission. He was on a training run in the sand dunes near Vung Tau when the heat took him. 36 days into his deployment, he died of heat exhaustion before the program had produced any of the operational results it had been built to produce. The most dangerous thing in Phuoc Tuy Province, for a tracker dog, was not a Viet Cong rifleman. It was the sun. The temperature in Vietnamese sand dunes in May, in direct sunlight with no shade and no water within immediate reach, created conditions that Cassius's body could not endure. This was the program's first lesson about its own limitations, arriving before the program had demonstrated its first success. Handlers updated their protocols around heat management. The cool air of the helicopter flights became not merely pleasant, but physiologically necessary. Relief the dogs were given as standard procedure, because the work the field required needed an animal that had not been depleted by the approach to it. Tiber arrived to replace Cassius, assigned first to Lance Corporal Norm Cameron of 7 RAR and later to Private Brian Meehan of 1 RAR. He would carry out a deployment that demonstrated both what the tracker program could endure and what it could not. Tracker teams operated on a consistent procedure across every deployment and every unit they supported. After a firefight, after any engagement that produced enemy casualties or a rapid withdrawal, the call would go back to Nui Dat, and a team would be airlifted by helicopter into the area of operation. On at least one documented occasion, when terrain made landing impossible, a handler and his dog were winched directly from a No. 9 Squadron RAAF Iroquois on a rescue hoist, descending into the jungle on a cable to begin a track that could not wait for a clearing. The dog would be brought to the last confirmed enemy position, to a blood trail, to a footprint, to the general residual scent of people who had recently been there and departed in a hurry. The handler would give the command, the dog's nose would go down, and the team would move. A trained tracking dog working a strong scent trail moved at something approaching a jog, not the careful, methodical pace of a man reading physical signs. The dog pulled into its harness and ran the track, and the team ran with it. And what had previously been a withdrawal route that dissolved into impenetrable vegetation became a line through the jungle with a direction and a destination. The handler read the dog's body language as they went. The acceleration when the scent strengthened, the hesitation when a direction change needed to be found, and the particular posture, the head that came up and the body that went rigid, that meant the animal at the end of the lead had detected the presence of a human being in the immediate vicinity. The point. The moment when the intelligence advantage transferred from the enemy to the Australians. The teams found what the jungle had been hiding. Wounded Viet Cong who had crawled away from contact and were lying in undergrowth with the expectation that no follow-up force could locate them. Bunker systems that entire patrols had walked past without seeing, built and concealed with a craftsmanship that the eye alone could not penetrate. Food caches, weapons stores, the infrastructure of an insurgency that depended on the jungle's invisibility to function, discovered by an animal that was not interested in visibility at all. In November of 1967, Private Tom Blackhurst of the 7th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and his dog Justin located a group of Viet Cong during Operation Santa Fe in the northeast of the province. The enemy had withdrawn from an earlier contact and had every reason to believe the jungle had absorbed them. The tracker team was called in. Justin found them approximately 30 yards ahead. The team opened fire. 2 Viet Cong killed, men who had planned to survive that afternoon and did not, because a Labrador retriever could smell them through the undergrowth. During Peter Haran's first tour with the 2nd Battalion, his team came upon a clearing in the jungle. Caesar backed out of it immediately. Haran continued forward. The dog circled back to him and sat down squarely on his handler's boot, physically blocking him from moving. A short time after Caesar sat down and refused to budge, the team established that the clearing was booby-trapped with mines and improvised explosive devices. The platoon commander had already triggered an M16 landmine in the surrounding area, wounding several men. Had Caesar not sat on that boot at that specific moment, Haran and approximately 20 soldiers behind him would have continued forward into a prepared killing ground. Haran would later describe what Caesar had already understood about that clearing. He knew where the mines were, where the tripwires were strung, and he could cover ground chasing the enemy at speeds that literally took your breath away. The same capability operated against a different threat during Ian Hall's second tour as tracking team commander in 1968 and 69. One of his team's dogs stopped at a tripwire connected to an explosive device and would not allow the handler to proceed. Hall's account, offered nearly 60 years later, was unembellished. Had the device been activated, it would have killed the handler and possibly a number of other persons. Private Robert Pearson of the 9th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was handling Julian during an operation in which Delta Company had discovered a bunker system in thick jungle. Contact was made with 2 Viet Cong, 1 wounded. Julian was put on the blood trail and followed it approximately 150 to 200 meters through the bunker systems before collapsing under a tree from exhaustion. Pearson and his covermen were lying at the edge of the track when Pearson looked up the trail ahead and saw, at approximately 7 or 8 meters, a claymore mine pointing directly at the position where the 4 of them were lying. They crawled backwards out of the killing zone without triggering it. Julian's collapse at that precise moment had been the margin of their survival. 3 of the 11 Australian tracker dogs were each credited with 5 or more confirmed enemy kills in direct engagements. Not trained to attack on command, not trained to detect mines or booby traps, despite recommendations from several soldiers that mine detection dogs should be part of the program. They did both anyway, with a frequency that the official record underrepresents because the intelligence contribution, the bunker systems found, the wounded captured, the operations mounted on information that tracker teams generated, was never systematically compiled into a single accounting. The staff of the Australian Infantry Centre produced their assessment in 1968. Their conclusion was specific. Combat tracker teams were the only effective weapon for pursuing the Viet Cong into areas where they felt safe, given the absence of any other method capable of following their movement through that terrain. By 1969, the jungle had ceased to be the reliable shield it had always been. The Viet Cong noticed. Their response confirmed, as clearly as any intelligence assessment could, how seriously they regarded a capability that 11 dogs had introduced into the Phuoc Tuy jungle. The most direct measure of that assessment was the bounty. Enemy fighters who could demonstrate the destruction of a tracker dog or the killing of a dog handler could receive payment for it. Across the Allied forces in Vietnam, this bounty system was documented in the accounts of men who served in the program. The American records were the most specific, noting substantial rewards for the elimination of dog teams. For the Australian tracker teams, the existence of the bounty is confirmed in the recollections of veterans who served in the program. Though the precise sum was not recorded in any primary source, this account has been able to locate. What the bounty established, regardless of the exact figure, was a formal institutional acknowledgement from the Viet Cong command structure that the tracker teams were worth spending money to eliminate. This was not a tactical response to a local inconvenience. It was a strategic calculation conducted by professional soldiers who had assessed a specific capability and decided it was dangerous enough to merit a dedicated countermeasure. The Viet Cong learned to cross water when withdrawing from contact, the standard measure against a tracking dog, which loses a scent trail at a water crossing and must work the far bank to reestablish it. They took more circuitous withdrawal routes, trading speed for the reduction of a clear trail. They began setting ambushes on their own retreat paths with greater frequency, exactly the threat that Julian's blood trail had almost walked into in the bunker system. Every one of these adaptations cost the Viet Cong something. Time, predictability, the ability to disappear quickly and completely, which had been the foundation of their tactical system in Phuoc Tuy, now required additional measures that slowed them down and made them more vulnerable to the pressure the Australians were applying. The enemy's formal determination that these dogs were worth money to kill was measured against what the Australian government would eventually say about the same animals. a form of distinction that arrived 50 years early. In the Phuoc Tuy jungle, the relationship between handler and dog was not simply professional partnership. It was the operational foundation on which everything the tracker teams accomplished was built. And it looked different from the outside than it felt from within. Caesar had remained in Vietnam when Haran rotated home in June of 1968. Haran was promoted to corporal and posted back to the tracking wing at Ingleburn as a dog handling instructor, training the next generation of handlers for a program whose results he had personally produced in the field. Caesar, meanwhile, was assigned to incoming handlers from 4 RAR, then 5 RAR, then 9 RAR, then 7 RAR, serving continuously through 4 additional battalions as each one withdrew from Nui Dat and was replaced. He carried with him, through handler after handler, the accumulated knowledge of the province. Haran would return to Vietnam in February of 1971 on his second tour as an infantry section commander with 3 RAR, walking the same Phuoc Tuy jungle on foot, where he had once moved with a dog at the end of a lead. He went back without Caesar. That fact does not appear in any official document about either of them, but it is present in every sentence Peter Haran ever wrote about the war. Dennis Ferguson had trained Marcus through the same program. Marcus was described by a later handler as a very fine tracker dog with a big heart and a very gentle nature, an animal who would never give up. Where Caesar had the Kelpie's working intensity, Marcus had the Labrador's steadiness, a quality that would sustain him through 5 handler deployments, across 5 battalions, and through the entire duration of a war that his first handler believed he was coming home from after his 12 months were done. Ferguson was responsible for every aspect of Marcus's life from the first morning of training, and when it was severed at the end of his first tour, the loss was not something that administrative language had adequate words for. The handover procedure was designed to facilitate the transfer of the dog's working relationship from one handler to the next. The departing handler was required, in the final days before his rotation home, to completely ignore the animal he had spent a year working alongside, so that the incoming handler could begin building the new relationship, without competition, from the old one. Veterans described this as harder than the contacts and the mines and the bounty on their heads. Pretending, in the final days before getting on the plane, that the dog did not exist. Ferguson did this at the end of his first tour. Then he came back for a second, and Marcus was there to meet him, and he did it again. Ian Hall's second tour of duty ran from 1968 to 1969, serving as tracking team commander, visual tracker, and handler. His team's dogs were Milo and Caesar. Hall's description of working with those 2 animals, offered nearly 60 years after his return, was precise. They were real characters, he said. One was a real larrikin, the other not so much. Different personalities altogether. They liked to play, and they also had their quiet moments. They were like his brothers. They were part of his family. Even now, he said, he could clearly smell the smell of a wet dog pressed against him after a day's patrol in monsoon rain. Because you spent so much time together, you understood the dog, and the dog understood you. You were virtually one and the same. Not every story from the tracker program was gravity and sacrifice. Justin, assigned to 7 RAR, bit another dog and destroyed Army equipment at some point during his tour. The Army's response was remarkable in its institutional thoroughness. Justin was formally charged with disorderly conduct and conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. He was sentenced to 2 weeks in his kennel on half rations. The handler's punishment, if any, was not recorded in available sources, which suggests either that the Army's sense of proportionality was functioning adequately, or that someone in the chain of command decided that charging a Labrador with a military offense was sufficient bureaucratic achievement for one day. Justin served his time and returned to operational duties without any apparent reduction in his professional effectiveness. Running beneath all of these stories was the knowledge that every handler carried from the first day of deployment. His tour lasted 12 months. The dogs lasted 3 years. He would get on a plane. The dog would stay. And what that cost the men who lived it was not something the program's official record attempted to measure. On the night of the 15th of May, 1968, the largest assault on an Australian position of the entire Vietnam War began. The Battle of Fire Support Bases Coral and Balmoral was part of the second phase Tet attacks conducted by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army forces across southern Vietnam in the late spring of that year. The first Australian task force had deployed outside Phuoc Tuy Province to interdict communist movement toward Saigon. The scale and intensity of what struck Fire Support Base Coral that night was not what the Australians had designed their task force to fight. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces attacked in battalion and regimental strength, in what military historians would later describe as the Australians' largest, most hazardous, and most sustained battle of the war. Among those present at Coral that night were Private Brian Meehan and, beside him, the tracker dog Tiber. During the first assault, Meehan had kept Tiber in a narrow fighting pit, lying on top of the dog for hours while the mortars and rockets fell. Together, they felt the shock waves from the detonations. They saw the yellow flame from tree bursts overhead. They heard and felt the fragments and bullets passing. Tiber held through that first assault. The attack was eventually repelled. The Australians counted their casualties and prepared for what the first night's events suggested about what was likely to come. 2 nights later, the enemy returned. Meehan chained Tiber beside him. A rocket-propelled grenade detonated meters from the dog's position. The chain broke. Tiber bolted across the fighting positions where one RAR soldiers were engaged in hand-to-hand combat through the mortar and rocket fire toward the perimeter of the fire base. Les Tranter, who commanded the tracker teams, radioed an urgent message when he realized the dog was running. Mick Bindley, the communications officer at the Firebase Comm Center, spotted Tiber and went after him. He made, as he later described it, one of his less successful rugby tackles at the dog and missed. Then asked himself the very reasonable question of what the hell he was doing chasing a dog around at that particular time of night, and very smartly returned to his pit. Nobody else went after the dog. There were other requirements. Tiber reached the perimeter of the firebase and went through it. The perimeter of any Australian firebase in Vietnam was ringed with claymore mines and anti-personnel mine belts designed to kill anyone who crossed without authorization in darkness. He crossed it at a dead run, in complete darkness, during an active ground assault in which the perimeter itself was under fire. He came through without detonating a single device. He returned the following morning at approximately 10 o'clock, moving through the Australian lines with the posture of a dog that understood it had done something significant and was uncertain how that understanding would be received. Tiber lay down on Meehan's boots with his head turned away. Meehan gave him a pat and a drink of water. He told the dog he didn't blame him for going over the hill. He hadn't liked it much either. If he'd had 4 legs and could move that fast, he might have taken off himself. Tiber was never again an effective tracker. What the rocket-propelled grenade had done to him was not categorized as a combat wound in any official document, but was not described as anything other than shell shock by anyone who observed him afterward. He was gun-shy. He jumped whimpering into ditches when Australian artillery fired nearby. He wandered without apparent purpose around the Nui Dat base. In August of 1969, an Australian Associated Press correspondent wrote about his condition in Australian newspapers. and the report triggered a ministerial inquiry. The official response assessed the situation as follows. Tiber was happy, friendly, and showed no outward sign of neuroses. He was no more aimless than any domestic pet. The latest veterinary report was that Tiber was well-adjusted, but possibly lazy. The Melbourne Herald had published its own assessment of the same dog in May of 1969. There was a shell-shocked digger who would be in Vietnam until he died. He was Private Tiber, a black Labrador tracker dog. A rocket-propelled grenade had burst only a few feet from him in May the previous year. And since then, he had been gun-shy, sometimes jumping whimpering into a ditch when Australian artillery or mortars fired. Tiber was retired in June of 1970 and transferred to Gordon and Rosalind Selleck, who were working at the Australian Embassy in Saigon. He was photographed with them at the time of the handover. Visible on his collar in the photograph were his Vietnam campaign ribbons. Someone had decided, informally and without any institutional process, that Tiber had earned them. He had. The ministerial inquiry had not reached that conclusion. The veterinary report had cited possible laziness. The medals were already on the dog. The Australian Army had decided, before the first tracker dog was deployed, that when the dog's operational service ended, they would not be returning to Australia. The reason given, when a reason was given at all, was the cost and complexity of quarantine. What was not given, what the handlers were not told, what the men who applied and appealed and offered to pay the costs themselves were never told, was the real reason. An Army veterinary report had established that large numbers of American tracker dogs in Vietnam had died from a tropical disease thought, but never confirmed, to be transmitted by ticks. The disease acted rapidly, producing massive hemorrhaging in the major organs. It could be carried without visible symptoms. The report's recommendation was unambiguous. No tracker dogs should be allowed to return to Australia, even under strict quarantine protocols, until the mode of transmission had been identified and controlled. Australia's isolated ecosystem was the reason the recommendation carried the force it did. The science was defensible. The decision not to communicate it to the men most affected by it was not. Dennis Ferguson applied through every available official channel to bring Marcus home at the end of his first tour. He offered to pay the quarantine costs himself. He was refused on every occasion, without explanation. What it left him with was not the knowledge that there was a documented biological risk the Army was managing responsibly. It was the knowledge that his government had decided his dog's life was not worth a straight answer. Gary Polglas had been the handler of Julian. He was accidentally killed in Vietnam in April of 1968. After his death, his mother applied to have Julian brought home. The case attracted parliamentary attention, and in response, the Polglas family organized a public campaign. They raised enough money to cover the quarantine costs for all 11 tracker dogs, every single one of them. The Army said no. By 1971, Marcus was exhausted. He had been caught in a violent night attack, a barrage of mortar fire and machine gun fire, and had emerged shell-shocked, his eyesight failing. Ferguson, on his second tour, demanded Marcus's return to Australia and was refused again. Marcus was given to Lieutenant Colonel Val Brown of the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, the New Zealand Force commander in Saigon. He died of natural causes shortly before the final withdrawal of troops in December of 1972. On the 17th of November, 1971, Marcian and Milo were brought by helicopter to Saigon to meet their new owners. Marcian went to R. Brash, the counselor and consul general at the British Embassy. Milo went to J.R. Cochran, the assistant manager of the Chartered Bank. The handover photographs exist. Handlers in uniform, dogs beside them, diplomatic and banking officials in civilian clothes reaching out to animals who had spent their working lives in the Phuoc Tuy jungle. Australia's first Australian task force withdrew from Phuoc Tuy Province in late October and early December of 1971. The base at Nui Dat was handed to South Vietnamese forces on the 16th of October. The province that the task force had worked to secure for 5 years began returning to Viet Cong influence within weeks of the Australians' departure. What had been accomplished in Phuoc Tuy had been real, and it did not survive the withdrawal by a meaningful margin. The tracking wing at Ingleburn was closed. The training methodology, the institutional knowledge of what worked and what did not in specific types of jungle terrain, the accumulated experience of 5 years of operational tracking, all of it was allowed to disappear with the troops who had produced it. The program had not been classified. It simply was not maintained. The silence that descended over it was the silence of institutional indifference, quieter than suppression, more durable than neglect, and harder to reverse than either. The veterans of the tracker program came home to a country that did not know what to make of the war they had fought. The men who had served with the tracker teams carried what all Vietnam veterans carried, with an additional weight. They had left their dogs behind in circumstances they had never been given a satisfactory explanation for. And the institutional record of what those animals had accomplished was not something the Army appeared interested in maintaining or publicizing. The first formal reunion of Australian Army trackers and war dog veterans took place in Queensland in March of 2002. 30 years after the last tracker dog had been handed over in Saigon. The institutional memory of what 11 animals had accomplished in Phuoc Tuy Province between 1967 and 1971 had not been maintained in any official form in the intervening period. It had been kept alive by the men who had served in the program. In the halting, non-linear way that difficult memories survive. Peter Haran had acquired Caesar's dog tag in October of 1987 at a 2RAR trackers reunion, 19 years after he had left Caesar behind at Nui Dat. He did not receive it from the Army as part of any formal process. He received it from the men he had served with, at a gathering they had organized themselves, in the way that veterans attend to things that institutions leave undone. Caesar's dog tag is now held in the collection of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. The journey it took to get there, from a dog's collar in Phuoc Tuy, to the British Embassy in Saigon, to a reunion 19 years later, to a memorial collection 33 years after the first deployment, maps the program's relationship with official memory with a precision that no document could improve on. In 2000, Peter Haran published his account of the tracker program under the title Trackers, The Untold Story of the Australian Dogs of War. Reviews at the time described it as revealing the Australian Army's little-known use of combat tracker dogs during the Vietnam War. Little known. In the year 2000, 33 years after Caesar had stepped off a Hercules at Nui Dat. 3 of his fellow dogs had each been credited with 5 or more confirmed enemy kills. The teams had been assessed by the Army's own infantry center as the only effective weapon for pursuing the Viet Cong into the areas where they felt safest. All of that had happened. In 2000, it was described as little known. That phrase was a more complete accounting of the program's institutional afterlife than any formal history had managed. On the 7th of April, 2001, a permanent memorial was unveiled at Alexandra Headland on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. It bore all 11 names and an inscription whose closing words said what the program's veterans had been waiting to hear since the final handovers in Saigon. They stayed behind. They were the best. All gave something. Some gave all. Those who knew you will never forget you. Haran returned to Vietnam with his son Brady, who made a short film of the visit. They went back to the specific jungle track where Caesar had refused to let his handler walk forward into a booby-trapped clearing more than 30 years earlier. Haran stood in that jungle and described that day as the worst of his life. What he meant, and what the film made clear without requiring elaboration, was that the worst day of his life was one he had survived because of what Caesar did, and that his son standing beside him in that jungle was the evidence of it. Without that dog, the man in the jungle would not have had a son to stand there with him. A bronze statue of Caesar was placed at Edmondson Park Station in New South Wales, built on land near the original Ingleburn training facility, where the program had been established in 1966. The station serves thousands of commuters daily. Haran, speaking from Adelaide at the unveiling, said that for the sculpture to be placed so close to the dog's original home was something he could never have imagined, and that every member of the public using that station would see Caesar was just an amazing thing. It meant, he said, that Caesar and his mates would never be forgotten. On the 6th of June, 2017, Australia introduced the Canine Operational Service Medal. 2 awards: the Canine Service Medal for military working dogs that served at least 5 years, and the War Dog Operational Medal for those that served on overseas operations for at least 28 days. Australia became the first defense force in the world to formally recognize military dog service with a medal. Both were posthumously awarded to all 11 Vietnam War tracker dogs, to Caesar and Marcus and Tiber and Justin and Julian and Janus and Milo and Trajan and Juno and Marcian, and to Cassius, who had died in the sand dunes near Vung Tau in May of 1967, 6 weeks after arriving, before he had tracked a single enemy through a single meter of Phuoc Tuy jungle. The date of the medal's introduction was 50 years after the first 2 dogs had deployed. The Viet Cong had placed a bounty on these animals in 1967. The Australian government issued them medals in 2017. In 2019, an article published on the Australian Army's professional journal argued for the reintroduction of a dedicated combat tracking dog capability. Its author noted that there was currently nothing in existence that could replicate the ability of a tracking dog to isolate a single human odor, follow it for many kilometers, and provide early warning when approaching a threat. He was making this argument as though the capability had never existed, because for the purposes of the Army's institutional knowledge in 2019, it essentially had not. The tracking wing had been closed nearly 50 years earlier. A serving officer had to argue from first principles for something that 3 generations of soldiers had built, proven, and been allowed to abandon. Ian Hall, who had served as tracking team commander in Phuoc Tuy in 1968 and 69, said in an interview in 2026 that when the 24th of February came around each year, the National Day for War Animals, he thought about the dogs he had worked with in Vietnam, what they had done, and how they had allowed him to come home. The Viet Cong put a price on their heads and understood their value immediately. The Australian government put medals on their names 50 years later and called it recognition. In the distance between those 2 responses, in the decades between the bounty and the medal, the real cost of the program was paid by the men who could not bring their dogs home, and by the dogs who stayed behind in a country that was itself running out of time. Their names were Caesar, Janus, Juno, Marcian, Milo, Trajan, Cassius, Julian, Justin, Marcus, and Tiber. They did not return from war. There is no monument to them in Canberra. What exists is a drinking trough on the Sunshine Coast, and a bronze dog at a railway station near Ingleburn, and the memories of the men whose lives they preserved. Men who smell wet fur and monsoon rain, 60 years later, know exactly where they are. All gave something Some gave all. If you believe those 11 deserved better, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand how Australia's other forgotten wars produce the same silence, watch this next.